Hey Calvary Chapel Petaluma, thank you so much for joining us today. There's a lot of exciting things coming up. Let's go to the announcements.
We are so excited for our summer camps this year. We've got camps for kids that are starting third grade all the way through graduating high school, and we hope that if you're in that age or if you have a kid in that age, that they'll be at camp. Kids Camp is our first one coming up. It's going to be July 5th through the 8th. And then Abide High School Camp will be July 15th to the 18th. And we'll be wrapping up the summer with our Junior High Camp, which will be August 8th through the 11th. If you want to get more information about these camps or if you want to sign up, you can just go right to our website, calvarypetaluma.org.
Calvary Petaluma, so good, so glad that you're here. And I want to invite you to pray about a couple of things. Would you pray for Pastor Felix and the school on Mfangano Island in Kenya, all the kids there that we support? We want to not only support them financially, but pray that God would meet all of their needs. So let's lift them up this week. And also in our own community, let's pray for St. John's Anglican Church, Pastor David Miller, and the wonderful people that are a part of the body of Christ over there. Let's be praying for these things this week. Well, hey everyone, thanks for watching this message. And wherever you are, wherever you're from, I'm so glad that you're here. And just before we dive in, I want to remind those of you that have been a part of Calvary Chapel Petaluma that we set out at the beginning of this year to seek God for renewal. Renewal in our hearts, renewal in our lives, renewal in our minds, renewal in our church, renewal in our families, our communities. And so we wrote down words that we were offering to the Lord as a prayer and a hope for Him to renew these areas of our life. And so just as we're a little bit of the way through the second quarter of this year, if you can believe that already, I want to remind you to keep seeking God for that renewal. Keep walking in faith and trusting Him and acting in any way that He would lead you to work for that renewal in your life. And so my word for this year was renew my faith. And it's not because I was struggling to believe in God anymore, but I just realized that over the years, my walk can become so comfortable. I can become so familiar with the things of God. And I don't want to stop growing. I don't want to stop stepping out and seeing God do great things. And so I'm asking God to renew my faith. And I'm so excited about the story that we're going to look at in God's Word because it has a lot to do with faith. And it's a great example for us. You know, as a parent, I'm always trying to figure out how to teach my kids things. And what amazes me over and over is how much they teach me. I can't tell you how many times one of my kids has asked me something. And in trying to help them understand, I find myself putting things together and making new discoveries. And so I learn just as much as hopefully they do, if not more. A few weeks ago, I took my youngest daughter out on a date and we were discussing what was to her a big decision that she'd been thinking about all year. And the time had finally come for her to make this decision and she still didn't know what to do. And so we were talking it through and I asked her if she'd prayed about it. And I could tell that the question frustrated her because she looked up at me and said, "Dad, I've been praying, but I don't know how to hear from God. I don't feel like God has said anything, and so I don't know what to do." And she wanted to know what so many of us want to know. How do you hear from God? How do you know what God is telling you to do? And how do you make decisions in light of God's will? I wonder if any of you that are listening to this right now can relate to that. So many people that I know right now are asking these kinds of questions. Should I move? Should I take this job? Should I quit my job? What school should I go to? It seems like a lot of people are wrestling with these kinds of questions right now. And so what I want to talk today about is how we learn to settle in and live in pursuit of all that God has for us. How do we make decisions and discern God's will for us. And more specifically, if I could say it the most precisely, I want to ask this question: how do we hold on to the promises of God? Because that's the life we want to live. We want to live in pursuit of the promises of God. We want our decisions to be informed and shaped by the promises of God. And so how, in the midst of all of life's ups and downs, how do we hold on to the promises of God? Today, we're going to look at the life of a man named Caleb, who is going to help us a lot, I think, with this question. Because he held on to a promise that God made for 45 years, and he never gave up on it, and he never stopped living in light of that. Just imagine that for a minute. What's the longest you've ever held on to a promise? I mean, without forgetting about it, without discarding, but held on to a promise that you were living for and in light of every day. It's amazing to me that Caleb could hold on to this promise for 45 years. And just as we look at his story here today, we want to look back, because not everything that we're going to read today is going to tell us the whole story. So we just want to remind ourselves. I want to kind of set the stage for what we're going to read today. Maybe you remember that Caleb was born as a slave in Egypt, which means he would have seen the deliverance of Israel. And just stop for a minute to think about everything he would have seen, all of the plagues and how God parted the Red Sea. Caleb would have seen the water that came from the rock, God's miraculous provision on a daily basis of manna. Caleb would have seen God's presence manifest at Mount Sinai. He would have heard the voice of God there, and on and on. If you just think of the things that Caleb saw and heard along the way, it's pretty amazing. And so Caleb was there when Moses led God's people to the border of Canaan, the promised land that would become their inheritance. And if you remember this story, Caleb was chosen as one of the 12 spies that would go in and check out the land and come back and bring a report. And so when the spies came back, Caleb was one of just two, him and Joshua, that said, essentially, let's go for it. God's promised us this land. He's going to be with us. You guys wouldn't believe the grapes and the honey. This is a land that's flowing with milk and honey. It's an incredible place, so let's go for it. But everybody else wasn't focusing on the provision and the blessing and the fact that God would be with them. They focused on the giants in the land, the cities that were fortified and would be difficult and dangerous to conquer. And so 10 spies had a bad report. 2 had a good report. That was Joshua and Caleb. And the people freaked out. They said to Moses, "Oh man, why would you bring us all the way out here from Egypt to die? We'll never be able to take down those giants." And so the people pick up stones to kill Joshua and Caleb, who had brought the good report. But God stops the whole scene, and in that moment makes a promise to Caleb and Joshua that while that generation that didn't believe God would die in the wilderness, Joshua and Caleb would live to see the day and actually claim a special inheritance. And so from there, we know that Caleb wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And just before you pass over that too quickly, remember that means he would watch his own generation slowly die off. He would see close friends and family members never enter in, but die out in the wilderness. And then the day would finally come where Moses died, and that generation previously that was full of unbelief died, and now a new generation comes up, and under the leadership of Joshua, Caleb and the rest of Israel enters in And Caleb would have found himself fighting alongside of Joshua and his countrymen as God drives out their enemies and as they experience over the course of several years many victories. And so now we come to the part of the story where finally the land is being divided up. Each tribe is being given their inheritance. And here's where we meet Caleb again. After all these years, after all these battles, after all of the time in the wilderness and everything that he had seen and heard, now Caleb is at the place where he's going to receive his inheritance. And here at the end of Caleb's life, as we watch him and see what he does, we're going to learn how to hold on to the promises of God and live in pursuit of all that God has for us. So let's open in our Bibles to the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 14, and let's look together at this story of Caleb. There's a few movements to these verses that I just want to outline for you, and we're going to begin as Caleb remembers the promise here in Joshua 14. Caleb remembers the promise. As the story opens, the tribe of Judah's come to Joshua for their inheritance, and Caleb reminds Joshua the promise that God made to him 45 years ago. And I love thinking about this as the story opens because Joshua would have remembered, he would have known about this promise because he was there. He heard it for himself. So listen as Caleb reminds Joshua about what God promised to him. Joshua chapter 14, verse 6. It says, "Then the people of Judah came to Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, 'You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God in Kadesh Barnea, concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again as it was in my heart. But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt, yet I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God." Caleb's recounting what took place there so many years ago. And Caleb's reminding Joshua of the promise that was made. And not only that, though, we're going to see in this second movement, these next few verses, how Caleb is recommitting himself to claim this inheritance. It's not just that Caleb's reminiscing, he's actually ready. He's saying in so many words, I'm in. I'm up for the challenge. Listen to what he says. It's amazing. We'll keep reading in verse 10. Caleb says, "And now behold, the Lord has kept me alive." Just as he said, those 45 years since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am this day 85 years old. Imagine that. I'm still as strong today as I was in that day that Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then for war and for going and coming. How amazing is that? How awesome would it be to say that? I want to be like that when I'm 85. To be able to say, I'm ready. I'm just as strong as I was then, and I am just as eager to be a part of what God's doing today as I was in my younger years. Caleb's not only remembering the promise, but he's recommitting himself as he reminds Joshua about these things, that he's ready to participate in the work that God's doing. And so we come to this third movement then when Caleb actually makes his request. He requests his inheritance here in verse 12. And I love this because you have to admire Caleb. What an amazing guy he is. In the years where it would be so easy to kick back, it would be so easy to slow down, it would be so easy to give up and say, I already fought my battles and I've given enough. It's someone else's turn. It'd be so easy after all that he's been through to be cynical or critical or just a grumpy old man. But I love Caleb because at 85 years old, he's still in the fight. He's saying, come on, guys, let's do it. Give me the hardest assignment. Give me a challenge. Look at what he says in verse 12. So now, give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day, for you heard on that day how the Anakim were there, with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord said. I love this because it's as if Caleb had a score to settle. So many years ago, it was the Anakim, the giants, that kept Israel out of their inheritance. It's what caused that generation to perish in the wilderness. And so now they're in, the land's being divided up, and Caleb's saying, you know what I want? Where are the Anakim at? Let me have that battle, Joshua. Let me go once and for all settle this score, because I know today what I knew back then, that the Lord is with us. I love this. I love how it comes full circle so many years later. And so the final movement, the fourth movement here in these few verses, we see Joshua's response and result in verses 13 through 15. And I just picture this scene in my head. I picture Caleb's request, give me the hill country. Let me at the giants. I know they're in fortified cities, but I'm up for the challenge. I'm ready for the task. And I just have to picture Joshua, who's also old at this point. Remember in chapter 13, that's how the Lord talks to Joshua. He says, Joshua, you're old. And I just picture Joshua, this old man, listening to his friend Caleb saying, give me the hill country, let me at the giants. And I just picture this kind of smirk coming over Joshua's face. Caleb, are you serious? He hears the request of his old friend. And I wonder if Joshua thought for a moment, what should he do? Maybe it's too hard for someone who's 85. Maybe it's too risky for his old friend to go into battle like this. But I love what Joshua does. Look at what he does in verse 13. So Joshua blessed Caleb, and he gave Hebron to him, the son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. And therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, to this day, because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. And now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim, and the land had rest from war. What a story. What a character. What an example Caleb is. What an inspiring man that he was, even in his older years. He pulls off this heroic victory, and he becomes this amazing example of what it looks like to live by faith, because he held on to the promise of God. How did he do it? How did he hold on to the promise of God for 45 years? And of course, the answer is only by faith. Did you notice in those verses what it kept saying about Caleb? He says it about himself in verse 8. Because Moses said it about him so many years ago in verse 9. And this apparently becomes his reputation, that everyone comes to know this about him in verse 14, that he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. It's an interesting word. It's an interesting phrase, because to say that he wholly followed the Lord, it can mean that his heart was undivided. His heart wasn't compartmentalized. That's why some translations translate the phrase, he wholeheartedly followed the Lord, because his whole heart was available and open to the will and the plan of God. But here's the thing, when you really dig down into this word, into this phrase, what it actually means is his heart was full, or it was filled. And I think the point is this. I think what it points us to is the fact that to have a heart that's whole but empty is of no real use. Yes, we want our hearts to be wholly available, undivided, uncompartmentalized, and offered to the Lord, but we want our hearts to be full of courage, full of intention. Caleb's heart was full of faith. And this is so important because when you ask, how do you hold on to the promises of God? You have to realize that the promises of God are faith activated. The promises of God become powerful when they enter into a heart that is full of faith. If the promise of God comes to a heart that's empty, that has no faith, it does no good. A promise that we aren't planning on acting on will lose its power in our lives. It will lose its value unless we plan on putting it to use. That's why Jesus said faith is like a seed. If you have faith even the size of a mustard seed, you could move a mountain. Faith has to be put to use, and a promise of God has to be acted upon. And so faith activates the promises of God. That's where we get to experience the power of God. And so here's the principle. When we think of faith this way, when we consider how it's faith that enables us to hold on to the promise of God, and when we see that faith is like a seed, it has to be put to use, here's the principle that I think is so powerful for us to consider today. The way we hold on to God's promises is by letting go. The way we hold on to God's promises is by letting go. We experience the power of God's promises when we're willing to let go of whatever else we're holding on to. That's the lesson for us, I think. We often talk about faith in the way that it takes hold of the promises of God. But if faith is like a hand that can take hold of the promise of God, then we also must learn by faith to let go. Because how could we take hold of the promise of God if our hand, so to speak, is already full of something else? You can't. And that's the lesson, I think, from Caleb's life. And so what I want to do is look with you at three things, three lessons in letting go from Caleb's life, three lessons of faith that help us learn how to hold on to the promise of God. And the first, when we talk about faith, I want to look at the faith that faces fear. And the lesson of letting go is letting go of our comfort. Faith that faces fear and lets go of comfort. See, Caleb's whole story, as we said already, begins at a pivotal point in Israel's history. They're on the border looking at the land, and the report of the spies come back. The land is there. It's an amazing place, but there's real challenges. There's real dangers. There's giants. And this wave of fear comes over God's people. And Caleb is with Joshua saying, hey, we have to let go of that fear. We have to let go of the comfort that we so often feel in the safety of a familiar place. That's the challenge. What's familiar to us feels safe. What's up ahead, what's unknown, the challenges that we face, that causes fear. But to hold on to the promise of God, we have to be willing to let go of the comfort of the familiar, and we have to learn to face those fears. I think that's what Caleb's life does for us. It inspires us to not be afraid. It reminds us that Jesus didn't die to make us safe, that he saved us to make us dangerous. And that's what Caleb is. He's dangerous to the enemies of God because he's willing to go to the uncomfortable place to face his fear by faith. And he has in his hand the promise of God, what God said he would do. And so we see Caleb letting go of the comfort of what he's known and facing his fear in faith. Well, secondly, I think another lesson that we see from Caleb is a faith that embraces the mundane and lets go of control. Faith that embraces the mundane and lets go of control. Wherever you see faith that takes hold of the promise of God, you see it letting go of everything else. And so often what we want to hold on to is control. We have a plan. We have a way that we think it should work. There's something that we want to do or we want to see happen. And so we hold on to our plans. We hold on to our agenda, the way that we think it should go. Where do we see in Caleb's life, though, him willing to let go of that in order to hold on to the promise of God? Well, here's where I see it. I see it at the point when God tells Israel that the generation that doesn't believe is going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And what amazes me about Caleb is he stays with the people of God all through that time, all through their wilderness wanderings. I would think, man, Caleb had every right to be frustrated. He wanted to go in. He was willing to face his fears. Why should he have to suffer because of the others' unbelief? But Caleb knew that even at that point, God made him a promise. You will live, and you will live to the day where you will inherit what I've promised. And so Caleb is willing to march through the wilderness with God's people for 40 years. He's willing to embrace the mundane. What about us? I think for us, there's so many things that God has promised us, and yet we think that we have a plan of how that should work and the way that it should go. And so often we run into times and places with God's people where it's just not going that way, or where things become difficult or there's problems. And it's so easy to just give up, to just abandon God's people, to say, man, look at these people, look at what they're doing. But I love Caleb's heart because he doesn't do that. 40 years. He stays in it with God's people, wandering through the wilderness, embracing the mundane year after year, month after month, week after week, just waiting in the wilderness for a generation to die, holding on to the promise of God. That's real faith. And we see the faith of Caleb holding on to the promise, willing to let go of control and how he thinks it should work out. Well, thirdly, I think we see in Caleb a faith that moves on a maybe and is willing to let go of certainty. I don't know if you saw this when we read it, but when Caleb makes his request of Joshua in verse 12, he uses a really interesting word. It's a word that we probably don't normally associate with faith. Because as Caleb reminds Joshua of the inheritance that was promised to him, and as he says, Joshua, let me have this hill country and go up and face these giants, he says this in verse 12, it may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord said. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like faith. I don't know that the word maybe is something that I would associate with faith. So how is this faith? Because I don't think any of us would read this and think that Caleb is suddenly doubting or he's suddenly wavering. But I think if you remember the promise that God made in Numbers 14 to Caleb on that pivotal day, when one generation wouldn't enter in and Caleb would have to wait for the next to come up, God said that Caleb's descendants would inherit the land. He would live to enter in, but it would be his descendants. And so there's this gray area, there's this ambiguity where Caleb now has entered the land, but it hasn't been fully possessed. And now that it's being divided up, there's still battles to deal with. And so Caleb doesn't know if he's going to make it through this next battle. He has no guarantee. But he's willing to move forward in faith on a maybe. He's willing to take what he does know about God and move forward into an area where he doesn't know. And I love this about Caleb. This is so powerful to me because if we only operate in the realm of certainty, we will be limited. And I think if we confuse faith with certainty, there's so much that we'll miss that God wants to do. See, faith includes certainty. It involves certain things that we can be certain about, but it goes beyond certainty. Faith moves beyond the realm of certainty where we begin to experience a confidence that isn't controlled by our circumstances. And so Caleb, he doesn't know if he's going to survive the battle. He doesn't have the guarantee that he's going to make it through the next fight. But he's willing to move forward on a maybe as he holds on to the promise of God in faith. And I love this. I love this about Caleb. He's willing to go down swinging. Maybe the Lord will be with me, he says. But if not, I'll go down in a blaze of glory. Man, I want to live like that. I want that kind of faith. I want the kind of faith that knows how to hold on to the promise of God and knows how to let go of my need for comfort, control, and certainty so that I can take hold of the promises of God. I remember when my son Tim was playing Little League and how the coaches would drill into the minds of the kids as best they could. You never want to strike out looking. If you've got 2 strikes against you and there's anything close, man, swing the bat. And you might strike out. That's part of the game. But never strike out looking. Always go down swinging. I think Caleb shows us that in the life of faith. I think he shows us that in the way that he's willing to hold on to the promise of God and let go of everything else. And you know, when I sat with my daughter several weeks ago and she wanted to know how you hear from God, you know what I told her about that decision that she was facing? I told her, you know, God is so good when there's something that he has for us that's really specific, he's always so faithful to make it clear. He'll always make a way when there is no way, and he'll do it in a way that's undeniably his hand. And when it's really clear that it's something he doesn't want us to do, he'll close the door in a way that it remains closed and we can't open it no matter how hard we try. Those are the times when God's will is clear. But all the rest of the time, God gives us a choice. God actually says, you know, I'm going to let you choose. And this is where I think we get scared. This is where we wonder, well, what if I get it wrong? What if I make a mistake? What if I fail? What if I make the wrong decision? But this is where we can learn, like Caleb, how to hold on to the promises of God. Did you know that if you fail, God is a great teacher and he's a gracious Father? And even if you fail, you will learn and your faith will grow. So you don't have to be afraid. That's what promises from God do for us, is they take away and allow us to let go of our fear, to let go of our need for comfort and control and certainty, and to just go for it, because with God, failure is never final, and so we can move forward by faith. I want to encourage you to do that today. Even if it's on a maybe, I want to encourage you to go for it, to go down swinging and to believe that God will work all things together for your good, because we're called according to his purpose. That's his promise. And so we can hold on to that and let go of everything else. All right, well, for your application challenge this week, I want you to think of a challenge that you're facing in your life. And you know the step to take that would be pleasing to God. Maybe you know what God wants you to do, but you don't know how it will work out. It feels risky. You can't guarantee the outcome. I want to encourage you to take a step of faith, to hold on to the promise of God, and to honor God and to make that an offering of faith. And so you don't have a guarantee of where it will go or how that person will respond or what will happen. It's a maybe, but what you do know is that it's pleasing to God. Faith is always pleasing to Him. So go for it. Take the swing.